I'm probably going to need a drum roll for this one. Something really cool just happened, and I want to thank you for this. First, let's step backwards just a bit to the start of things. I started this podcast after searching for a wine podcast to get into and failed to find one. I consulted many of the lists of the top wine podcasts. There are quite a few lists like this. Some wine podcasts were just too stiff for my liking. I mean, would I want to drink wine with these folks? So stiff. And others were just not interesting, not really what my idea of a wine podcast was. And this was before I'd really listened to any podcasts of any sort. And some were a little too, how can I say it? Chirpy. I think we all know what this is. Plenty of chirpy podcasters out there. I try not to be chirpy. Let me know if I ever come across as chirpy, will you? So, with necessity being the mother of invention and all, I thought about producing my own wine podcast. With some serious behind-the-microphone experience, I just need to figure out how it all works. I found a very helpful podcast host site, and I set up shop. And honestly, if you're thinking of going for it, buzzsprout.com will be your best friend. January 2021, the first episode was uploaded. We are 9 months in. Remember those lists I was combing through to find a wine podcast? And now, that drum roll, please. The Tall Mike Wine Podcast has debuted on one of those lists. Debuting on the FeedSpot list of the best 45 wine podcasts, the Tall Mike Wine Podcast at number 14. Okay, now back to work. Welcome to the Tall Mike Wine Podcast. I'm Mike Stone, and this is the wine podcast that's not all about wine. The wine podcast like no other. Heard in 24 countries, on 5 continents, and in 42 of these United States and the District of Columbia. From Milpitas, California to Bonnie Lake, Washington. From Mount Arlington, New Jersey to Big Timber, Montana. From Kansas City, Missouri to Boardman, Oregon. But what I really want to know is, who is listening in those other countries? The United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France, Australia, Mexico. I'm not any sort of world traveler, and with the exception of Canada, I've never visited those other countries, not even one of them. So, who's there listening? If you feel like dropping me a line and letting me know how you came across the podcast, I'd be delighted. I'll even send you some Tall Mike Wine podcast coasters. My email is tallmikewine@gmail.com. Simple, easy. Speaking of being in touch, I heard from Mary Renner up in Spokane. She tells me she paid a visit to Cote Bonneville in Washington's Columbia Valley simply because she had heard about them, my interview with Carrie Shields recently, here on the podcast. That is pretty cool. Thanks, Mary. You may have noticed by now that I again am not introducing a guest on this episode, and it's true. I'm not in the vintner's room sitting across from another person, sipping wine, having a civilized conversation. Instead, I'm sitting at home. There are 2 small dogs in the room with me, one of whom is snoring. As I mentioned last time, harvest season brings a lot of excitement to wine country. And the harvest at Nicholson Ranch has been ongoing, but it also creates scheduling issues. But things are wrapping up, drawing to a close. We're nearing the time when the last of the grapes will be picked, and a sort of calm will descend upon the countryside. We'll get back to regular conversations very soon, I promise. In the meantime, I can tell you, I'm sipping some lovely wines. Right now, for instance, in my glass, currently, an Italian wine from a producer called Montepeloso. This is a small estate in one of the hotter areas of Tuscany. The wine is called Eneo. That's E-N-E-O. It's a blend of Sangiovese, Colorino, and Merlot, a Super Tuscan, technically. No new oak is used in the aging of this one, but it spends time in second and third use barrels, giving the wine nice texture and a certain rustic quality, yet retaining elegance and fruit, black and red fruit. This paired nicely with the turkey burgers I made for dinner tonight, which were also pretty good. Another couple of wines I had recently, a Cabernet from Sonoma. Not Washington, not Napa, Sonoma. This one was called Huge Bear. And as you might imagine, it has a very cool label and is a very full-bodied style of Cabernet. This one was all that and more. And from the 2014 vintage, still has a long life ahead of it. That wine paired up nicely with some tasty Italian cheese. Now, there was a Napa Cabernet in the mix recently from Martin Estate, a tiny winery in the Rutherford AVA of the Napa Valley. The wines are also everything you want in a Napa Cabernet, crafted by well-known winemaker Aaron Pott. That's P-O-T-T. The Martin Estate is owned by Greg Martin, who I got to meet several years ago on a visit to the estate, which is a big old house right on the vineyard with a pool. Greg Martin is one of the foremost collectors, dealers, and overall experts on arms and armor in the entire world. He is a fascinating guy, and that big house is packed to the gills with his collection, to the point of being a bit creepy, actually. But sadly, I recently reached out to his people to get him on the podcast and was denied. The quote, I believe, was, "Interviews are not of interest at this time." Oh well. Someone will come talk to me, I promise, and we'll have fun. But for now, the Tall Mike Wine Podcast was conceived and is written, edited, and produced by yours truly. Much of the cool music and things are found on a website called freesound.org. If you need a drum roll or a klezmer tune, check it out. I record and edit the podcast on a program called Audacity. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, give us a rating. And if you're feeling clever and wordy, write a review. They tell me it helps a lot. Thanks for joining me. I'm Tall Mike Wine. Call me Mike. Cheers.